Thank you, David, and thank you for the panelists for participating and taking the time to talk to us. And of course, my question comes from the perspective of a small agency. And what I wanted to understand is, to what extent is there scope for competition authorities of small countries to initiate antitrust proceedings against the tech giants? To what extent such competition authorities should wait and see what happens, especially in the US and the EU. We were very explicit about our policy of Me Too, of expecting the digital platforms to act in Israel in the same way that they're interacting that they are behaving in the US and the EU. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about this policy. And the other side of the question is, do you believe that the international digital platforms would be willing to accept situations where they operate in each jurisdictions according to its local competition law rules? Do you think that there is a risk that they will announce that a small local jurisdiction burdens them too much with their unique remedies and they will stop operating in such jurisdiction altogether? So these are two sides of the same issue, and I would like very much to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Michal. So Eleanor, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. It really is a great pleasure to be here, and happy to honor Michal Halperin, as you are, as you say, last week at the agency, and to honor what you have done in the past, and to thank all of you for this great program. And also, it was wonderful to hear the really excellent keynote speech of Herb Hovenkamp. So for Michal, for your questions, this is what I think about Me Too. To some extent, you cannot wait. If you were to wait for US, you would be waiting a very, very long time. For the cases that are in the courts, they are going to take years. For the legislation, we don't know what will happen. For EU, it is different because I think the Digital Markets Act is going to be adopted. And the UK also, I think that they are also well on the path to adoption. So at the same time, though, there certainly is a proper stance to see what is happening in the world and maybe choose from it. So we see South Africa, for example, choosing to go forward on mergers and digital. And Australia, of course, we have seen choosing to go ahead and very good ideas on media. And in addition to choosing what you think are good ideas that might affect Israel, I think it would be a great idea, but you're probably doing this, to invite feedback from the Israeli businesses and consumers as to what they feel is hurting them most, and maybe find your own niche as well as trying to join the international conversation. Hard to do, I realize, but and going full force alone is extremely expensive and time consuming. There has to be some middle ground. Oh, will the big tech withdraw? This is a real threat, as they tried to do or were on the verge, Google and Facebook, on the verge of doing with Australia. And they couched their statement in terms of saying, this is something we cannot live with. It is so far against our business model. My own view is that dialogue with the big tech can feel out what they can live with. And if you're in the realm of what is developing haphazardly as international standards, I think it would not be a problem. Thanks.
Thanks, Eleanor. A short thought I had about what you said is that if what's happening is specific legislation in the EU that goes beyond antitrust, so Me Too would actually mean legislation by us rather than what the antitrust authority is doing. So that's also an issue that the panel could discuss. So Fred, what do you think?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. A word of caution. I mean, my first reaction to the first question was the answer is yes to both sub-questions. Yes, the Young Competition Authority has to think before it acts. And yes, it should go after big tech and such cases. The first point, all over the world, there is lots of competition authorities who are asking themselves a combination of questions which are not yet resolved. Herb Ovenkamp has mentioned some of them, but I think there are a few others as well. For example, the fact that platforms are attached to a technology and not to a market makes competition quite different because competition is not reduced to competition on a market, but more, as Herb said, on a cluster of markets. And it's not so easy to deal with those competition issues. The second issue is that within platform competition interacts with competition between platforms. And I'm not sure that we have it straight. If you take the EU decisions, they just ignore competition between platforms, and they only focus on within platform competition between the complementers and the platform itself. Is that the right way to go about it? Not clear to me. Third, I think that competition is, Herb has said that, is largely through innovation and not duplication. So it's a different type of competition than the one that we're used to dealing with. Another one is that, of course, scale and quality, at least when it comes to data treatment, come together. Okay, so you can't have one without the other, which is the reason why Herb was against the structural measures. But exactly how do we separate, or how do we weigh the two sides? Okay. So there's a lot of thinking to be done. There's also a lot of thinking to be done on which instrument is the best, competition or regulation. A word of caution, rushing into making decisions without having solved any of those questions may be dangerous. Second, can young jurisdiction participate in the discussion which is taking place? Absolutely, yes. They do have the intellectual resource to contribute to this debate, and they should. And that is one of the reasons why we have so many of those debates at OECD. I mean, but it could be, of course, in a wider forum, to try to work out some clear understanding of what the issues are. And I think that small jurisdictions have a big importance there. Third, enforcement. So there are two types of enforcement that a small jurisdiction can make. New cases, cases which haven't been dealt with, and cases which have been dealt in other countries. The first category, very useful to the community because it pushes the ball and can be set as an example for other jurisdictions. On the second case, the digital system is a system which is aterritorial, which means concretely that most of the cases in one country are exactly similar to the cases of the same nature in another country. There is very little local content, really. In those cases, having multiple cases, each jurisdiction bringing its own cases, is a terrible waste. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources, and can lead to massive under-enforcement elsewhere. And on top of this, for some small competition authority, it may not even be feasible because they don't have the resources to do it. So what do we need? Can we overcome this? Yes, absolutely. Michal Gal here, a few years ago, proposed a new instrument of cooperation with a different perspective at the time, but which was mutual recognition of decisions. And if there is one sector where mutual recognition of decision could be useful, it would be this, to avoid having to repeat. Those cases are long, they are very costly. One can save a lot of time and money by having a mechanism like this. There has been some talk at OECD about whether whether we need new instruments of cooperation. I think that this is clearly one to address the issue that you are raising. The second question is, I'm not going to duplicate what Eleanor said. Of course, big platforms can decide that they are not, first of all, Australia was not the first example. Google News, for example, does not exist in Spain because Spain was the first country that wanted to impose a payment for using the news. Okay. And what did Google say? Say, goodbye, we're not going to provide this service in Spain. So they can do it, but there is a limit. And the limit is exactly what we've seen recently with the French case, the French Google ad case, okay, where there was a settlement in front of the French Competition Authority on the fact that Google had preferred, self-preferenced its system. The same system is used in many other jurisdictions because it's used over the world. Several other jurisdictions have said at the same time as the French started the case that they were looking at the same issue. Google settled the French case and said, I'm going to generalize this solution to the rest of the world. In other words, when many competition authorities, small competition authorities, decide to open a case simultaneously or quasi-simultaneously, then it becomes much more difficult for large digital firm to say, I'm just going to get out of all those countries. They cannot do this. And in that case, one can arrive at solutions which are diffused around the world, saving a lot of time and a lot of resources. So I think that there's a different type of cooperation for competition authority, which is cooperation on which cases to prioritize and which cases to start.
That's really interesting. Collusion between antitrust authorities.
That's right.
Which may be a good thing. Thanks very much, Fred. And Bill?
Thank you, David, and thanks to Barak, to Michal Gal, to Michal Halperin for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful program. On the first question, I think the short answer is yes. If I were Michal Halperin, I'd say, fine, how do you do it? I'd say that to begin with, the ICA is not an ordinary authority. It's not a small authority with a terrible shortage of human capital and limited experience. It may not be the largest, but it's notably different. And I think that Michal and her predecessors have built an institution that is able in many respects to take on demanding matters. So how would I do it? I'd start with mapping out what's out there in the world today. I'd want to map out everything that's taking place with big tech. That's a big research project right now. That's a hard job, but it's the starting point to see what's there. And along with that, as you were suggesting before, I'd want to map out the timetable for the matters that are in flight, both with respect to litigation and to proposed legislation. Everything we've talked about today so far, with the exception of the Epic Apple case, in the US is going to move very slowly. Same in Europe with the big new legislative reforms. The DOJ case against Google doesn't go to trial in theory until September 2023. Decision 2024. First level of appeal 2025. Supreme Court final decision maybe 2026. Just to sketch out a rough timetable. That's roughly within our lifetimes, but not by much. And when you take all of the matters that have been queued up, they're not going to come to earth for quite a while. And the measures that Eleanor mentioned, the DMA and the DMU, those have a long way to go before they get home. And my guess is they don't really start to take effect until 2023. That's a long way over the horizon with lots of other implementation challenges to come. But I think a way to start is to identify what's out there already and how long is it going to take. And you do that as a way of trying to identify areas that haven't received as much coverage or could. Second is to identify the resources that you want to commit to this. And you know what your existing commitments are. You know how much capacity you have. I'd suggest that a way of thinking about this is not only to look at your own capacity, but because in Israel, you have an extraordinary intellectual infrastructure to draw on. You have wonderful university faculties represented on this call. You have research capabilities that would enable you to convene proceedings, hearings, discussions, the conversation that Eleanor referred to before, to have well-focused events to discuss what should we be doing and to take stock. I don't think that you can do this alone, but as you recognize already, what Alan Fels used to call co-producers are essential to the success of an agency. And when you have these kinds of extraordinary academic hubs who are willing to work with you, they are your allies. I would say your necessary partners in the kind of exploration that identifies what specifically you might want to do. After I've done the mapping out and I've identified my partners in this process, I then target very specific practices that have a distinctive appeal to or significance in Israel, in the smaller jurisdiction. I don't try to bring the grand slam case that's going to cover the universe and all it contains. I'm going to focus on something more narrowly. And I'm going to think about how this could be prosecuted. There's a staggering difference between the Epic Apple case in the US and everything else that's going on. Look what the district judge did in Epic Apple. She said, I'm giving you 3 weeks on my calendar. We're going to try the case. And by the end of the summer, I'm going to issue a decision. None of this astonishing willingness to tolerate more discovery, endless discussions that puts the DOJ Google case in trial in September 2023. So to narrow the focus, to go to the judge in the courts and say, in looking at this larger experience globally, we have an idea how about we can do this in an expeditious manner, and to focus the case very rigorously on a smaller topic that might have larger significance. And in all instances, learning everything that one possibly could from this larger global experience. Now, as Fred was saying, that puts a premium on working with counterparts abroad to ask what's going on. What did you do and why did you do it? In particular, a candid discussion in which your counterparts abroad, because you're supposed to be feeding back into this process simultaneously everything that's being learned. And all of these prosecutors are learning a lot, to get their candid views and response to your question, what do you know now that you wish you knew on day one? And how is that affecting the design of your process? Ideally, all of the prosecutors would be doing that with each other, saying, this is a dead end, don't go there. This is a promising approach, take this approach. And to do that and develop a disciplined, targeted topic for discussion. I think a smaller jurisdiction can do that. And not to be abstract about this, a smaller jurisdiction such as Israel has the capacity to carry out that kind of strategy and do it effectively. Second question, what happens if you try to do this? How will larger platforms react? Will they accept it or not? I am sure they go through the process of asking, what's the cost to me of adapting my business practice to the demands of this jurisdiction? Especially this irritating smaller jurisdiction that keeps nipping away at me like a mosquito. How much do I have to pay attention to them and heed them? So one is that they're going to ask, as they have in other countries, what's the cost of adaptation? Second, they'll ask themselves, what's the cost of just walking away? Closing up shop and saying, it's been nice knowing you, goodbye. I would say that with the strategy that Fred was discussing, I think that cost of walking away goes up a lot. Because I think what we're seeing is that when you assemble a critical mass of activity globally, and when you draw the Venn diagram and see overlapping cases with dissimilarities, if you're in the corporate headquarters of the enterprises, what do you notice now? That Venn diagram is becoming very busy and cluttered because so many different jurisdictions are focusing their attention on specific practices. I think for the business enterprise at some point, the board of directors will sit down and say, how do I get out of all of this? Is there a way for me to establish a universal settlement, not literally bringing everyone in the room? There's no room on earth big enough to hold them all, but to have a process of deciding, how do I make all of this go away? What approach can I take to do that? When you have the critical mass, it becomes harder for the firm to simply look at one jurisdiction and saying, I'm going to take a walk. But that critical mass depends a great deal on the cooperative process that we've just been discussing. Perhaps a bit later, we can talk about how one does that. I see there to be a greater and greater feasibility of making that cooperative process operate. And I'll suggest that a positive outcome of the grim COVID experience is that agencies have learned how to do that much more effectively than they did before. Thanks.
Very much.